Ella had been looking for a way out. The city had swallowed her whole since she moved there 6 months ago, and now, as the bills piled up, she needed a solution. Every day at the coffee shop was the same: long hours, little pay, and no real prospects. She needed something more, something different. One evening after her shift, Ella opened her laptop and started scrolling through Craigslist, hoping to find some kind of escape. Most of the ads were for odd jobs or cheap furniture, but there was one that caught her eye. The ad was simple: looking for assistant, great pay, serious inquiries only, email for detail. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't promising anything extraordinary, but the words "great pay" stood out to Ella. She clicked the link without hesitation. The description was brief: looking for an assistant to help with various tasks around the house. No experience required. Must be willing to work hard. Serious inquiries only. Contact me by email for more detail. Ella sat back, looking at the screen. There was no name, no phone number, just an email address. The vague nature of the ad made her feel uneasy, but the thought of financial relief pushed her to act. She needed the money. The rent was due in a few days, and she wasn't sure how she would make it. With a sigh, she typed out an email. "Hi, I'm interested in the assistant position. Could you please provide more details about the job?" She hit send and waited. It wasn't long before she got a reply. "Thank you for your interest. Please come by tomorrow at 4 p.m. to discuss the position. The address is 118 Thornfield Street. Look for the house with the black door. I will be waiting for you." The address wasn't far from where she lived. She quickly looked it up on her phone. It was in a quiet part of town, a few blocks away from the main streets. Ella didn't think much of it at first. She had no other plans, and the opportunity seemed too good to pass up. The next day, she dressed in her best clothes and made her way to the address. It was a cool afternoon, and the sky was covered with dark clouds. As she walked through the neighborhood, she noticed how quiet it was. Most of the houses were older, with tall trees casting shadows over the sidewalks. The street was nearly empty, with only a few cars parked along the side. When she reached 118 Thornfield Street, her heart skipped a beat. The house was enormous. It was old, with dark stone walls and overgrown ivy crawling up the sides. There was a large iron gate at the entrance and a set of stone steps leading up to a massive black door. Ella paused for a moment, staring at the door. It looked strange, like it didn't belong in such a quiet neighborhood. She swallowed hard, feeling a tightness in her chest, but she pushed the thought away. The money. She needed the money. Ella rang the doorbell. A few moments later, the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway. He was tall, older than Ella had expected, maybe in his mid-50s. His gray hair was neatly combed, and he wore dark glasses that obscured most of his eyes. He smiled at her, but his smile was too wide, too tight, like it didn't come naturally. "You must be Ella," he said in a soft voice. "I'm Greg. Please, come in." Ella hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside. The house was dark, much darker than she expected. There was no warmth in the air, and the faint scent of something unfamiliar lingered in the hallway. The walls were lined with old portraits, their frames dark and worn, and there were no windows to let in natural light. Everything felt heavy and Greg led her down a narrow corridor into a small sitting room. The furniture was old, with dark wood and plush upholstery. There were no lamps or light fixtures, just a single dim bulb hanging from the ceiling. It was almost as if the room was stuck in time, frozen in a forgotten era. "Please, sit down," Greg said, motioning to a chair across from him. "I'll get you something to drink. Tea? Coffee?" Ella sat down, feeling the weight of the air press against her. She could hear the soft ticking of a clock from somewhere in the house, but there was no other sound. It was as though the house had its own heartbeat, a steady rhythm that made her feel uneasy. "No, thank you," she said, trying to sound polite. "I'm just here to learn more about the job." Greg smiled again, his lips pulling tight. "Of course. Let's talk about the position. It's very simple. I need help around the house with organizing and cleaning. Some light tasks. But there's more to it than just cleaning." His voice dropped, becoming softer, as though he was sharing a secret. "I need someone who is willing to help with other things, but nothing too difficult. It's all very manageable. The pay is excellent, and you'll be treated." Ella nodded, though she was starting to feel more uncomfortable with each passing moment. The way Greg spoke made everything sound a little too cryptic. He hadn't mentioned anything specific, just vague promises of good pay and simple tasks. "I'm ready to start," she said, trying to push the feeling aside. The money was what she needed, and she couldn't afford to be picky. Greg's smile widened, and he stood up. "Good, follow me, and I'll show you where you'll be." He led her down a long hallway to a door at the end. Ella noticed that the hallway was lined with more portraits, but these ones were different. They seemed to be older, with faces that looked faded, almost ghostly. They didn't seem real. Greg opened the door, and Ella stepped inside. The room was small and dimly lit, with a single desk in the corner. The walls were covered with shelves, filled with dusty books, old papers, and strange objects that Ella couldn't identify. The air was thick, and it smelled musty, like something had been locked away for years. There was an odd feeling in the room, as though it was a place meant for keeping secrets. "This is where you'll work," Greg said, walking past her. "You'll be sorting through these things, organizing the papers, and cleaning the shelves. It's not hard work. You can start right away." Ella nodded, trying to mask the growing unease in her stomach. She sat down at the desk, feeling the weight of the room press in on her. She began to sift through the papers, but the more she looked, the stranger things seemed. The papers weren't just old. They were dated, some from decades ago. They were filled with names, addresses, and strange symbols she didn't understand. She picked up one sheet of paper and froze. It was a list of names she recognized, people she knew. Some were from the coffee shop where she worked. Others were people from her past, people she hadn't thought about in years. Ella felt her heart race. She put the paper back down and turned to look at the rest of the room. The shelves were filled with more papers, more names. Some of the names on the papers were crossed out, and others were circled in red ink. "Is something wrong?" Greg's voice interrupted her thought. Ella looked up, trying to calm herself. "No, nothing's wrong," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "I'm just trying to get organized." Greg nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Good. Keep going. There's a lot to do, and you'll be rewarded for your hard work." Ella couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The room felt oppressive, as though the air itself was holding her in place. But she couldn't leave. Not yet. She needed the money. As she continued to sort through the papers, she found more names, more familiar faces. But as she looked closer, she realized something that sent a chill down her spine. The names on the papers were all people who had disappeared. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her, a faint, muffled sound, like footsteps. But when she turned around, the room was empty. Ella felt the walls closing in on her. The sound of the clock ticking grew louder, and the air felt thicker, suffocating. She quickly grabbed her bag, stood up, and rushed to the door. But as she reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. The room seemed to close in on her, the shadows stretching out from the corners. The door creaked behind her, and she heard Greg's voice, soft and cold. "You shouldn't have looked." Ella turned around, her heart pounding in her chest. Greg's figure appeared in the doorway, his face twisted into a smile that no longer seemed friendly. He stepped forward, and the darkness in the room deepened. "You should have never come." Ella backed away, her breath coming in quick gasps. She had to get out. She had to escape. But the room was already closing in. I was in a tough spot. I'd lost my job, and the bills kept coming in. Every day I felt like I was one step closer to losing everything. With no other options, I turned to Craigslist, hoping to find some quick work. There were the usual odd jobs, dog walking, yard work, and other random things. None of it paid enough to make a dent in my rent, and I almost closed the app. Then, I saw an ad that stopped me. Looking for someone to clean my house. $300 for one day. Must be available immediately. I clicked on it, curious. The ad didn't have much information, just an address and the name Mr. Elias. The address was on the outskirts of town, in a part I didn't know, but I figured $300 was worth the drive. I replied to the ad, offering my number, and within minutes, I got a text back. "Hello. Thank you for your interest. Please arrive at 1875 Blackbriar Lane as soon as possible. This is a one-day job. Cash will be paid upon completion. I will leave the door unlocked for you." No small talk, no back and forth. It was clear Mr. Elias wasn't interested in wasting time. The message had an urgency to it, like he needed someone fast. I packed a bag with some basic cleaning supplies and headed out. As I drove, the houses became sparse and trees crowded the road. By the time I reached the address, I realized I hadn't seen another house for miles. The house itself was a massive old mansion, hidden behind a wall of overgrown bushes and ivy. It looked like it hadn't been cared for in years, with darkened windows and peeling paint. I almost turned around right then, but the thought of $300 kept me moving. I parked in the driveway and walked up the creaking steps to the front door. Just as Mr. Elias had said, the door was unlocked. Inside, the house was dimly lit and smelled stale, like it had been shut up for years. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick and musty. There was no sign of Mr. Elias, but a note lay on a small table in the entry. "Thank you for coming. Please clean every room thoroughly. Payment will be left in an envelope on the kitchen counter when you're I was starting to feel uneasy. Who hires someone, leaves the door open, and then just disappears? But I brushed it off, chalking it up to Mr. Elias's strange personality. I decided to start in the kitchen. When I found it, I noticed there was an old coffee cup on the counter, stained from years of use. I picked it up, only to freeze when I noticed something odd. The bottom of the cup was covered in a strange, dark residue that didn't look like coffee at all. It was thick and sticky, almost like tar. I shivered, set the cup down, and got to work. The hours dragged on as I cleaned each room. Dust, cobwebs, and clutter filled every corner. The house seemed much bigger than it looked from the outside, with winding hallways and rooms that led to other rooms. Each one was colder than the last, and the deeper I went, the stranger I felt, like I was being watched. Once or twice, I thought I heard footsteps, but every time I turned, the halls were empty. As I was scrubbing the bathroom sink, I noticed something else that made my skin crawl. The mirror above the sink was smeared with handprints, but these weren't normal handprints. They were large, elongated, with fingers that seemed too long. My heart raced as I wiped them away, only to find more underneath. The handprints had been layered, like someone had pressed their hands against the mirror over and over again. Trying to shake off the unease, I moved to the next room. It was a small study, with old, dusty books lining the walls. As I dusted the shelves, a book caught my eye. It was worn and frayed, with no title on the spine. I opened it out of curiosity, and the pages were filled with strange symbols and writing that I didn't recognize. Suddenly, a heavy feeling settled over me, and I felt like I shouldn't be in that room. I quickly put the book back and left, but the feeling stayed with me. By the time I reached the upstairs, the daylight was fading, casting long shadows across the hall. The top floor was even colder than the rest of the house, and every step I took felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I found myself whispering, just to break the silence. But it only made things feel more wrong, like my voice didn't belong there. The last room on the floor was a bedroom. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing a large bed covered in a dusty sheet. I noticed something odd on the floor near the bed, small scattered bones. They were clean, white, and carefully arranged in a strange spiral pattern. My stomach turned, and I felt a sudden urge to leave. But I told myself it was just some animal bones. Maybe an old pet someone forgot to bury. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that room. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard a soft scraping sound. It was faint, coming from the corner of the room. I froze, straining to listen, and the sound grew louder, like something dragging across the floor. I backed out of the room and shut the door, my heart pounding. Back downstairs, I felt a rush of relief as I entered the kitchen again. I glanced at the counter, expecting to see the envelope with my payment, but there was nothing there. I looked around, confused. I hadn't heard anyone come in, and the front door was still locked. That's when I noticed the basement door. It was slightly ajar, and a dim light spilled out from the gap. The thought of going down there made me uneasy, but if Mr. Elias was home, maybe he'd forgotten to leave the payment and was waiting for me. I called out, but no one answered. Against my better judgment, I stepped toward the basement. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder, and the dim light barely illuminated the bottom of the stairs. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small concrete room with a single bare bulb casting a sickly glow. In the center of the room was a large metal table, and lying on the table was an envelope. Relieved, I grabbed it, but as I turned to leave, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing in the shadows. It was tall, much taller than any normal person, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. My heart stopped as it took a step toward me, its bony fingers reaching out. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the envelope, and scrambled up the stairs as fast as I could. I reached the front door, threw it open, and didn't look back. I ran to my car, jumped in, and sped down the driveway, leaving the house and whatever was in it behind. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing, but I didn't stop driving until I was back home. When I finally calmed down, I remembered the envelope. I opened it, expecting to see $300 in cash, but my heart sank when I saw what was inside. The envelope held nothing but a note, scrawled in the same messy handwriting as before. "Thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed the company." I threw the envelope away and tried to forget what happened, but the feeling of those eyes watching me stayed with me. Weeks later, I looked up the address online, hoping to learn more about Mr. Elias, but I couldn't find any record of a house at 1875 Blackbriar Lane. It was as if the place didn't exist. Now sometimes at night, I feel like I'm back in that house, standing in the cold, dimly lit basement, and I can still see that figure in the shadows, watching and waiting. I'll never look for work on Craigslist again. I was broke. My roommate had moved out unexpectedly, leaving me with all the rent and bills. As I scrambled to find a new source of income, I scrolled through Craigslist, looking for anything that could bring in some quick cash. Most of the jobs were low-paying, but then I found something interesting. Need help moving furniture. $500 cash for one night. Transportation provided. $500 sounded like a lifeline. I clicked on the ad to read more. A guy named Martin had posted it. His note was simple and straightforward. He needed someone reliable to help him haul some furniture to an old house outside town. The job would take a few hours, and he'd drive me back home afterward. I didn't have a car, so that part was a bonus. I texted Martin, and he replied right away, telling me to meet him at a gas station on the edge of town at 7 p.m. He'd be in a white van, and he'd bring the moving supplies. The job seemed straightforward enough, and $500 was worth the odd timing. When I got to the gas station that evening, I spotted the white van easily. Martin was leaning against it, a big guy in his 40s with a thick beard and wearing a dark jacket. He seemed normal enough, if a little quiet. We exchanged a few words, and I could tell he wasn't a talker. He simply motioned for me to get in the van. The drive was silent and felt longer than I'd expected. We left the city lights behind, and soon there were only trees and stretches of darkness on either side of the road. The night felt heavy, pressing in through the van windows. I tried making small talk, asking about the job, but Martin just grunted in response, keeping his eyes fixed on the road. Eventually, we pulled up to a large, abandoned-looking house sitting in the middle of nowhere. The place was massive but rundown, with darkened windows and cracked walls covered in ivy. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Martin parked the van in front and motioned for me to get out. "This is the place," he said simply, pulling out a flashlight and handing it to me. "Let's get started." We walked around to the back of the van, and he opened it to reveal the furniture. There was a strange mix of items: a tall, ornate mirror, an old rocking chair, a heavy-looking trunk, and a few other pieces that looked like they belonged in a museum. The furniture was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it, like it held secrets. Martin didn't say much as we moved piece after piece into the house. The furniture was heavier than it looked, and I wondered how old it all was. Once inside, Martin directed me to place each item in specific rooms. The layout of the house was confusing, with long hallways that seemed to twist and lead to random places. The air inside was stale, filled with dust, and the faint scent of something I couldn't place, like damp wood mixed with something metallic. The last piece was the trunk, and it was the heaviest. We carried it up a narrow staircase to the attic. As we set it down, I noticed the attic was filled with boxes and old belongings, like the house had been left in a hurry. I glanced at Martin, but he only nodded and said, "That's it, we're done." Relieved, I started heading back down, but Martin lingered for a moment, his gaze fixed on the trunk. Then he turned and followed me downstairs. As we left the attic, he locked the door with a padlock, slipping the key into his pocket. I thought that was strange but didn't say anything. We walked back to the van, and I expected him to hand me my money and drive me back to town. Instead, he asked, "Think you could stay a bit longer? I'll double the pay. I just need someone to keep an eye on things here while I run a quick errand." $1,000 was too tempting to say no to, even if I was ready to leave. I agreed, and he handed me an old keychain with several rusted keys on it. "Lock up if you need to leave," he said, and then he got in the van and drove off, leaving me alone at the house. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. I wandered around the house, letting the flashlight beams sweep over the dusty walls and old furniture. The silence was almost oppressive. Every step I took seemed to echo through the empty halls. After a while, I heard something strange, a soft creaking sound, like footsteps coming from upstairs. I froze, listening. The noise stopped, and the house was silent again. I told myself it was just the old house settling, but something about it felt off. Curious but nervous, I walked back to the main staircase and shined the flashlight upward. The second floor was pitch dark, and I realized I hadn't seen any light switches since we'd come in. As I stood there, trying to decide whether to check it out, the sound started up again, this time louder. I forced myself up the stairs, each step feeling heavier as I went. The sound led me to a room at the end of the hall, and I hesitated before pushing the door open. Inside was the ornate mirror we'd brought in earlier. It stood in the middle of the room, and as I stepped closer, I noticed something disturbing. The mirror wasn't reflecting the room around it. Instead, it showed what looked like the attic, with the trunk sitting right in the middle. I stared, trying to make sense of it. My reflection was nowhere in the mirror, only the attic with that old locked trunk. Suddenly, I saw movement in the reflection. A shadow passed over the trunk, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was circling it. My breath caught in my throat, and I stepped back, feeling a chill run down my spine. As I turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in, and I banged on the door, shouting for help. Even though I knew no one was there, the air in the room grew colder, and I could feel something pressing in on me, like the walls were closing in. I looked back at the mirror, and the attic in the reflection was now empty. The trunk was open, and something dark and twisted was crawling out of it. Its limbs were long and spindly, bending in unnatural ways as it dragged itself toward the mirror, toward me. I backed away until I was pressed against the door, unable to look away. Then, the thing in the mirror turned its head, and I saw its face, pale with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. Its mouth twisted into a smile, revealing sharp, crooked teeth. I felt like it was looking straight into my soul, reading every fear and doubt I'd ever had. It took one long, bony finger and tapped on the glass, as if trying to break through. Suddenly, the door burst open, and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. The cold, oppressive feeling lifted, and I realized I had to get out of that house. I didn't care about the money anymore. I just wanted to be far, far away from that place. I ran down the stairs, barely keeping my footing, and headed for the front door. But just as I reached it, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate footsteps that echoed through the empty house. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the dark figure from the mirror standing at the top of the stairs, watching me with those hollow, unblinking eyes. I fumbled with the keys Martin had given me, finally managing to unlock the door. I bolted outside, sprinting down the driveway, not stopping until I was halfway down the road. When I looked back, the house was dark and silent, but I could still feel those eyes on me, watching from somewhere inside. I kept walking until I reached the main road, where I finally managed to get a ride back into town. I never saw Martin again, and I didn't bother trying to contact him about the money. Whatever was in that house was something I never wanted to see again. Days later, out of morbid curiosity, I tried to look up the address online, but I couldn't find any record of it. No one seemed to know anything about a house in that location. It was as if the place didn't exist, like it had vanished as soon as I left. Even now, I sometimes feel like I'm being watched, especially when I pass by mirrors. There's always this strange sensation that something is on the other side, waiting and watching. I don't think I'll ever feel safe around mirrors again, and I've sworn off Craigslist forever. I was struggling for money, desperate for any kind of work that paid quickly. Rent was due, bills were piling up, and my savings were gone. With few options left, I turned to Craigslist, hoping to find a job that could help me make ends meet. Most of the ads were the usual low-paying stuff: pet sitting, yard work, handyman gigs. But then one ad caught my eye. Need help clearing out basement. $600 for one night's work. One night sounded like a miracle. The ad didn't say much else, just that the job would take about 6 hours and the address was included. It was signed by Mr. Corbin. There was a phone number, so I called, expecting it to go to voicemail. Instead, a gravelly voice answered right away. "Hello. Hi, I saw your ad on Craigslist. Are you still looking for help with your basement?" "Yes," the man replied after a pause. "I'll pay you $600 cash if you can come tonight. I need someone who doesn't mind working alone." The mention of working alone made me hesitate, but I needed the money. "I can be there," I said. "Is there anything I should bring?" "No," he replied, sounding almost impatient. "Just come ready to work and be here by 7. He gave me directions to his house. It was on the outskirts of town, in a neighborhood I'd never been to before. I quickly got ready, packed a flashlight just in case, and drove out there, hoping the job would be as straightforward as it sounded. When I arrived, the house looked old and worn down. It was a 2-story house, with peeling paint and overgrown bushes lining the driveway. There was a dim light on in the front room, but no lights were on outside. As I parked, I saw a man standing by the door. He was tall, thin, and looked to be in his 60s. His face was mostly hidden in the shadows, but I could see he had gray hair and sharp, dark eyes that seemed to study me as I walked up. "You're here for the job?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, trying to sound confident. "Good. Follow me." Without another word, he turned and led me into the house. The inside of the house was as old as the outside. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, and the floorboards creaked under our feet. There was an odd smell, like damp wood, and something else I couldn't place. Mr. Corbin moved slowly, guiding me through the dimly lit hallway until we reached a door at the end. "This is the basement," he said, gesturing to the door. "It's mostly filled with old furniture and boxes. I need everything moved out. There's a back door down there. You can bring everything out that way." He opened the door, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. He handed me a small flashlight, which barely lit the way. "I'll be upstairs if you need anything," he said, though his tone made it clear he hoped I wouldn't. Then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone at the top of the basement stairs. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs. The basement smelled even worse than the rest of the house, musty, with a faint metallic scent that made me uneasy. The air was thick, and it felt strangely cold, like the temperature dropped as soon as I reached the bottom of the stairs. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, but I could make out the outlines of old furniture and stacks of boxes, just like Mr. Corbin had said. The walls were bare concrete, and the floor was covered in dust. I started with the furniture, lifting an old wooden chair and carrying it to the back door, as instructed. As I moved back and forth, I noticed strange things about the basement. There were deep scratch marks on the walls, like someone had dragged something sharp across the concrete. Some of the boxes were sealed shut with thick, old tape, and there were faded symbols drawn on a few of them. Symbols I didn't recognize. I tried to ignore it and focused on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. After about an hour, I opened one of the boxes, hoping to make the load lighter by removing some contents. Inside, I found old clothes, dusty and frayed, as if they had been there for decades. Beneath the clothes, there was a photograph, a faded black and white picture of a family. A man, a woman, and a young boy, all staring into the camera with blank expressions. Something about their eyes felt wrong, like they were too dark, too empty. I put the photo back, feeling a chill run down my spine. As I closed the box, I heard a sound, a faint whisper, like someone was speaking just behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was no one there. The basement was silent, but the feeling of being watched grew strong. I tried to shake it off and went back to work, moving the boxes and furniture as quickly as I could. But the sounds kept coming. Every few minutes, I'd hear a faint whisper or the sound of something scraping across the floor. Once, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, the room was empty. After another hour, I was nearly done. I was carrying one of the last boxes when I noticed something strange. There was a door on the far wall of the basement, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes. I hadn't noticed it before, and it looked out of place, made of heavy metal with a rusted handle. Curiosity got the better of me, and I set the box down, walking over to the door. I reached out and touched the handle, which was cold, almost icy. Slowly, I turned the handle and pulled the door open. A foul smell hit me immediately, a mix of rot and something worse, something that made my stomach turn. Behind the door was a small room, barely lit by my flashlight. The walls were covered in scratches, deeper and more violent than the ones in the main basement. The floor was stained dark, and in the center of the room was a large, heavy chair, bolted to the ground. Straps hung from the armrests and legs, as if someone had been tied to it. My heart pounded as I took a step back, feeling a surge of... Just then, I heard a sound behind me, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the basement stairs. I turned, shining my flashlight toward the stairs, but no one was there. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer, echoing through the basement. I backed away, nearly tripping over a stack of boxes as I looked around frantically. Then, I heard a whisper, clear and close, right next to my... "Help me." I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering as I tried to hold it steady. I shone it around the room, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one there. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence, something dark and angry, pressing in on me. Panicking, I ran toward the stairs, desperate to get out of the basement. But as I reached the bottom step, the door at the top slammed shut, trapping me in the darkness. I banged on the door, shouting for Mr. Corbin, but there was no response. The only sound was my own breathing, fast and shallow, echoing in the silence. After a few moments, I heard the whisper again, louder this time, filled with pain and desperation. "Help." The voice seemed to come from all around me, and I realized it was coming from the small room behind the metal door. I didn't want to go back, but something compelled me, some strange feeling that I couldn't explain. Slowly, I walked back to the room, shining my flashlight inside. The chair was empty, but the scratches on the walls seemed fresher, as if someone had just made them. I took a step inside, feeling the cold air wrap around me like a blanket. The voice grew louder, filling the room, and I could feel something watching me, something unseen but undeniably there. Then, I saw it, a faint figure, barely visible in the dim light. It was the shape of a person, thin and frail, with hollow eyes that stared at me with a mix of fear and anger. The figure raised a hand, reaching out to me, and I felt a surge of terror. I turned and ran, stumbling out of the room and back to the main basement. The whispers followed me, growing louder, filling the air with a chorus of voices, all crying out for help. I reached the stairs and pounded on the door, shouting for Mr. Corbin, begging him to Finally, the door opened, and I nearly fell out of the basement, gasping for air. Mr. Corbin stood there, watching me with a strange expression, like he knew exactly what I'd say. Is everything okay?" I stammered, trying to catch my breath. He nodded slowly, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "You're done here," he said. "Thank you for your..." He handed me an envelope with the cash, then turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, shaken and confused. I didn't say anything. I just took the money and left, eager to get as far away from that house as possible. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something behind, something I couldn't explain. The voices, the figure, the dark, haunted feeling of that basement, all of it lingered, haunting me long after I never went back to that house, and I stopped using Craigslist for work. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers, faint and desperate, calling out from the dark, "Help me."